Michelle.
Daniel.
OG Rose. So today we're going to talk about
debate or discussion. Nah, we're going to talk about discussion or debate.
No, it's going to be debate versus
Debate, discussion, no. But now that we've argued,
hilarious.
we're going to arrive at truth better, right? Or,
well, we're going to feel like we arrived at truth
because
better.
we argued and there was tension and then we resolved, even though all of that might just be another mechanism of self-deception. Because, why assume that just because there's an argument means you've gotten closer at the truth? And yet, for some reason, people think that way. But you did like an anchor on discussion or debate.
Yeah, no. It just, I was provoked to think about this because I was inspired to do it because I had a live with Javier Rivera on the history of dating. And afterwards, he had said something like, just kind of said something about it would be interesting to have somebody on who vehemently opposes
right.
The views we come to the conclusion, we come to the certain conclusions in our talk, right? You could say maybe that we're in agreement, but I think that it's because we've kind of done the work in the talk.
Sure.
And we kind of, in a sense, it's almost like it coalesces, right?
Right.
It coalesces to these certain conclusions.
Yeah, there's a lot of people, there's always a fear that you're just telling yourself what you want to hear, confirmation bias,
yeah,
if it's too smooth,
right.
What if we're just deluding ourselves and so on and so forth.
Yeah, maybe we're not being, self-skeptical enough, or maybe we're not challenging ourselves enough. Maybe we should, really have somebody who really disagrees, or really feels like a polar position, so that we can really, really be objective in our talk, right?
Right.
And I think that can be the concern, and I can understand where that concern can come from, because you do want to be self-skeptical, you do want to be objective, you do want to allow your views to be challenged.
Right.
At the same time, I think that if you've got people who are genuinely interested in pursuing truth wherever it leads, if you've got people who are very engaged in a dialectical process, if you've got people who are going to take on different viewpoints within that talk and think about counterpoints, there is a fight going on.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It's not between each. It's interesting because it's not necessarily between the two people in the talk or whatever, the four people. There could be more people in the talk, but it's like this. It's just like you're both climbing a mountain, right? Like on your. Just have this G.I. Joe imagery to it in mind. So there's still this kind of fight and struggle going on, but it's not like it's not as if the two people are duking it out necessarily.
Oh no, what you're describing, a lot of people worry about, especially in these philosophical discussions, between on dating, which I think is very important. There's always this concern that if we're not arguing enough, if we're not disagreeing enough, what if we're not advancing or what we're learning?
Yeah, what if we're not productive
What
here?
if we're not productive? And that will get into problems of game theory, metrics, all these. What is your metric? One of the things in a philosophical discussion, what you're trying to do is, like you say, climb a mountain, as opposed to, you are trying to ascend the idea itself, the topic. You are trying to climb to higher heights, better ideas about the topic itself. You're not trying to win against the person. One of the issues is in a debate, really someone is trying to win. It's the whole framing of a debate is people are coming in with their positions and they're trying to defend them. Yeah. You can say, but we learn because we figure out, but the idea is you learn because you figure out who's right. But you see, when you're dealing with big philosophical issues, very often the people involved, they're not sure. They want to know what's right, not who's right. And if something and if someone there happens to be right, it's secondarily. It doesn't matter if Michelle's the one who's right in the discussion, because her being right is secondary to the fact that the idea is right. Yeah. So the concern is very, very different. But of course, you're kind of trained to think that if there's not opposition, if someone doesn't oppose you, then the likelihood of you getting the idea right is less. But I think that's partly conditioned. Well, one, that gets into where you need to be able to judge the quality of the idea itself. Does everything logically build up, and one thing lead to the other? In analyzing that, and I think the point you're also making is that both parties, usually in a long philosophical discussion, have already done a lot of work on it on their own. And so they've already probably thought of a lot of the ideas that the other person has thought. And if the other person is genuinely seeking the truth, then they've thought those ideas too. And if they've thought about them, they've probably converged upon similar views. Yeah. And so there's going to be a lot of overlap, but that's not necessarily the same as agreement. You're overlapping because they're like, oh, I took those steps too up this mountain. It's interesting is, frankly, what tends to happen in the long 2-hour, 4-hour discussions, which again is very different from these 15-minute, 5-minute segments on the news, which are debate, but you're made to feel that that's how you're supposed to do it. Usually you'll notice the disagreements start to emerge in the philosophical discussions like 70% in. Like 3 hours in, because that's where it's like, okay, now that we've covered all the positions, now we're at the top. But there has to be a lot of work to understand, like, okay, this is what you think, this is how we go, and then you can get, because you can't, here's the funny thing, you actually can't have a disagreement with someone who you don't understand.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, Daniel, and it makes me think of this in the imagery of climbing a mountain. You know, you can both get to the top and then disagree upon which is the best view from the top of the mountain.
Absolutely.
So, you know, but you can't do that until you're at the top of the mountain.
That's right.
To say which view from the top of the mountain is the best view of the top from the top of the mountain, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So you have to actually do the work, climb the mountain, and then when you get to the top, you might say, "Well, I like facing eastward," and this person says, "Well, you know, I believe eastward facing is the right position or the true position," and the other person says, "Well, I think the westward position is the right position or the true position." And it's that is reasonable, and that is great, but that does take a lot of time to get to. So basically, like you've said, you can't really disagree until the entire arc has been presented. And a lot of times these stunted, like when the conversation is stunted, as in like it's interrupted basically early on, it's because of, like you said, misunderstandings. It's not disagreements, because you haven't had anything with, you can't disagree on something that's not like the full arc, basically.
Well,
in a sense,
most of the time when you hear people, you know, disagree, they're disagreeing on the premise level, you know, which is usually just misunderstandings. Like, for example, you'll listen to the abortion debate on the news, and they don't even understand each other's fundamental premises or terms. There's disagreement, but it's not real disagreement, because you can't have a real disagreement until you understand the other side, until you really enter into the system. And that's what you'll see in these long philosophical discussions, like, well, they don't really disagree, they're just kind of, you know, they're going back. Well, the other thing I will add is that often what happens is when philosophical people disagree, they ask a question, whereas when most people, like when politicians disagree, they say, I disagree.
so true.
Like the philosopher, like the more philosophical person asks a question. They don't tell you they disagree. They ask a question.
Exactly.
And the problem is too, if I just say the philosopher versus the politician per se, the politician will actually use disagreement as a power move.
Yes.
They'll say, I disagree, then fall silent and expect for you to bow over and apologize. You know, disagree.
Or somehow prove yourself.
Yeah, prove yourself more. But I can simply say to you right now, I disagree. And there's nothing you can do to make me agree. I can just simply not agree. You know. And so what ends up happening a lot of times in these philosophical discussions, a lot of the people have gotten to this place where they're having these discussions because, well, they've seen how, like, meaningless it is to just have that binary disagreement. They see how it's not productive. And they've learned to disagree in terms of questions. But that can feel so smooth that then you get nervous because you're so trained from the society to think that if there's not disagreement, there's no truth. And you're afraid that the agreement is a sign of a subjective, like it's a problem because the fact you agree means it could be feeding your confirmation bias, and that would be a subjective sign. Well, that would be a sign, of subjectivity as opposed to objectivity, and you're nervous about that. But really, what's critical to note is to conclude that smoothness, if we use that phrase, is a sign of confirmation bias, is a subjective assessment just as much as saying the disagreement in tension is a sign of objectivity.
Exactly.
Both of those are subjective judgments. You know,
exactly.
You got it. The question is, the feeling is irrelevant.
The feeling is irrelevant.
The question is the logic itself.
Yeah, does the logic stand itself? And the thing is, if it does stand, then yes, both people will come to the same conclusion.
Well, that's the joke.
That's okay.
It's like, of course they're coming to the same conclusion.
They're not coming to the same conclusion because they're just like, well, I feel better about just, you know, thinking the same way he thinks, or vice versa.
Yes.
It's not that at all. The whole point of you doing the conversation is to explore and challenge that.
Yes.
And
yes.
so if
and
you
flesh
happen to then
out.
Go back, like basically coalesce it, I like that word,
Yes.
back to that same conclusion, it's kind of earned in a sense, and in a way it should happen if it is the logical or if it is the truth point basically, because
and it's also like
in a sense, like, not that it should, like, it may not happen, but what I mean to say, if this is really about truth, right, then it would make sense that there would be that coalescing. Well, it's kind of like two people individually will come to the same point, and then if they share it, then if they're like, well, he thinks it, so maybe because he thinks it and I think it, maybe it's wrong. Well, no, maybe it's actually, like you've said, like, maybe that's even more reason. If they've done that, if you've both done the work, then it's all the more reason to feel, in a sense, validated that conclusion was actually logically come upon or derived or something like that.
If 5 people all conclude X from a genuine pursuit of truth, that's the key. If there's a genuine pursuit of truth and 5 people conclude X and one person concludes Y, there would be good reason to think that X is probably has something to do with reality. Now, if you have 5 people who all agree on X, and they are not genuinely pursuing truth, maybe they're in a political alignment or a tribe or something, well, that's different. That would be potentially evidence of the confirmation bias. So then context is critical. Context in the nature of the discussion and following how it forms. Also, too, again, philosophical people, they're going to have a 3-hour discussion. The issue is, probably because they're of the nature where they're trying to determine truth, so they give up their preference in favor of truth. They're probably going to agree on 80% of things, but it's not so much agreement because they, in their own independent lives, have reached similar conclusions. It's actually overlap. And overlap actually increases the likelihood that it's truth because they were pre-formed to the conversation. It just seems like they were formed in the conversation, but actually they were pre-formed. And so it's actually overlap as opposed to agreement. And overlap would increase the likelihood that it's true.
But what's beautiful about having like an extensive conversation is that like in vivo, basically, you do again. You work it out again. You're almost like, okay, yes, I have had this preformed idea or whatever, or like that I've basically worked, struggled to grapple to get to. But I'm willing to even like put it out there again and let's grapple it again.
Well, probably, and also
and I
too,
think that's great. And I think like the fact that one is even doing that, they don't. Like, sure, it's fine to have that moment of like, am I being objective? But it's like the fact that you're having an extensive conversation about that is probably good reason to believe you are indeed after the truth and willing to be objective at the cost of your own preconceived notion.
Well, a few things. The point of a discussion is the unfolding of the idea. The point of a debate is to determine what's right. And you can determine what's right on a very elementary level. You can stay elementary and determine correctness or quote-unquote rightness. I can be talking about 2 + 2 = 4. I'm right. But there's no unfolding at the elementary level. Like, unfolding is inherently trying to get very advanced. Whereas if your parameter or your metric is simply being right, you don't have to get more expensive. You can determine rightness on any level of complexity. So the goal of the discussion is an unfolding. The other thing, too, that's really important is in these philosophical discussions, like you meant it with Javier, you could, the fact that the conversation was with Javier, since the ideas are preformed, the person you are speaking with, you could actually trade them out, and your view of relationships would not shift. In problematic confirmation bias, you need particular people there to speak with who are going to tell you that you're right. Confirmation bias greatly is dependent on certain people being in the conversation. Whereas when you're doing philosophical discussion, the flow of the conversation will change, but the essential ideas themselves are not going to change because they're preformed. So that's another characteristic, because usually in philosophical discussion what happens is a lot of the ideas you're elaborating on, but nuggets of them were preformed. Unless in the conversation you have that magic emergent eureka moment where something kind of breaks through and you have a new thought you never had before. But here's the funny thing. A new thought, almost by definition, cannot be a product of confirmation bias because it can't, because it wasn't there to be confirmed previously.
Right, and that's what I was going to say. Like, I think it's a really beautiful combination of preformed, which are not I think that we can hear preformed and think, it's just preconceived notions. No. What preformed means you did you struggled Basically, you grappled, you read, you wrote, you thought, you considered, you debated yourself. Went through this whole process to get to that preformed idea. Okay, and that often is also laid in the foundations of many other conversations you've had with, let's say, Javier or the person you're talking with that you've had extensive conversations with. So you've got that. Okay. And then there's those, and then it's a beautiful combination of that, plus the eureka moments, and the beautiful kind of like, just kind of synchronistic kind of like occur, like these kind of, like you said, the eureka moments, those things that like come up that you didn't anticipate, but you're like, oh, that's really neat because we had this conversation, we're talking about this analogy now, or because we're having this conversation because of these two particular people, like Javier's on the oboe and I'm on the violin, and we're creating this like kind of song, and now we're kind of having these new in the moment revelation type of moments, and like you said, there's no way those are preconceived. Like these are not like dogmatic hammers. These are like, these are very unique, special, and very vivacious type of revelatory moments.
Well, and what you want to find in philosophical discussion is difference, not disagreement. Difference is more important than disagreement. Like, for example, like if you're say a David Hume scholar and you're just talking with David Hume scholars, well, that is probably not going to be the conditions for eureka or new thought. That's the problem with academia or college and specialization. But these philosophical discussions, when you've read, Rilke and Dante and different people, and this person over here has read like quantum mechanics and economics, that difference is going to provide you enough uniqueness, if you will, or difference. Difference is what you want more than disagreement. But the problem is in the specialist culture, it's all about disagreement because they're not different enough.
That's such a great point, and that kind of came up. Didn't it come up like with Ebert and you in the end of the year talk?
We talked about the specialization
and the difference, and like how that's not the word for difference. I mean that's such a great point. That's such a great point. So like if we think about that as an analogy, and actually in my anchor talk, I talk about instruments.
Yes,
I talk about symphony and I talk about noise, like clashing, like just destructive, clanging of instruments, almost in a like even the instruments themselves break.
Yes.
But the point is that, if we make this analogy, like, Javier's on the oboe, I'm on the violin, Daniel's on the djembe or something, like some drum.
Yeah, I love my djembe. Love my djembe. But go on. I wish I had. Gosh, I need to bring it down and start playing as you chat. Sit on it and hit it and all that, like, different thing. But anyway, I'm on my djembe.
You're on your djembe. And the thing is about that, the preformed aspect is you knowing darn well how to play your djembe. And Javier knowing darn well how to play his oboe because you guys have played them for so many times and so many lessons, and now you know how to play them. Now what is so unique and almost there's this kind of this really cool opportunity space in the talks are for the melody to come out of the harmony of those instruments. And the symphony of those instruments coming together. And it could only be that way because of those unique individuals.
Well, and what you're describing, exactly. There's an expertise, and
it's true that you could swap out and you'd have a new kind of interesting combination.
Assuming that they are up to that level of expertise.
Right, but so what's so cool is that what makes philosophical conversations that have done the work to kind of get there is that it is really one of one in that sense, because it's this very interesting combination. And it is really live there with this beautiful oscillation between the preformed and the eureka.
Well, the name of the game is difference plus difference and expertise plus other individuals who are different and expertise creates the philosophical discussion.
Right.
And you're not going to. The other thing that's really critical is those individuals. They are looking for the big, the big topics and the eurekas. And the big topics are on the systems level and the axiomatic level. But in order to get there, you have to do like the 3 hours of conversation to see the entire system that Javier is operating and to see the whole system that Michelle's operating in, and then go, okay, our systems are 80% the same, because of course they would be, because we're trying to conform to truth. But once you get to like the axiomatic and the high order premise things, you can start going, okay, you think that the conclusion of the axiom is Y, that relationships should stress self-sacrifice, and I think that it should stress ultimately self-sacrifice, but in a context of which maybe emphasizes self-realization in a Jungian, maybe in a psychoanalytical sense, right? Like you start getting what ends up happening on the high level. You start the quote unquote the top of the mountain, the view. You described the view at the beginning. Yeah. That's when you start talking about emphasis. That's when you start talking about like.
Well, this is. I'm so glad this came up, Daniel. The way you're saying this, and I don't mean to interrupt.
Sure.
But I will say really quick. The preformed is like we all practice our instruments individually, and then the eureka is the oboe, djembe, and violin are like making this cool melody that I've never heard before with that combination of instruments. So that's an interesting dynamic, and it's funny because when we were talking about this in the kitchen, remember how you're like that's like the relationships in general.
Yes.
Well, we actually Javier and I talked about the nuance difference.
Yeah.
The nuance difference. We don't have a place for that in relationships anymore. And that's I think that's made it even more confusing and even harder in the dating sphere and even into the marriage sphere because there's going to be so much nuance difference. It's like a hard to pin type of difference.
Oh yeah.
And that's the type of difference I think that philosophical conversations will ultimately have space for.
And that they're searching for.
And that they're searching for, and that will exist. But the thing is that it like all we have place for is the literal clashing of the red and blue parties, or like so we only have like the overt difference. We only really have space for that. So because our brains are so like trained and conditioned to think about I don't know, like any type of productivity or just even functionality as this clashing.
Yes.
Then we kind of feel like, well, if we're not doing like explicit clashing in a philosophical conversation, maybe we're not being productive enough. Maybe we're not being real enough. And it's like, well, no, it's actually like the more real to life is the nuance difference, which is quieter.
Well, the culture, the political, if you will, is basically always disagreeing on the premise level, whereas the philosopher is searching for the disagreement or difference. Not necessarily disagreement, it's difference on the systems level or the axiomatic level. Yeah. And the issue is to determine the axiomatic level, you actually have to get to the systems level. You can you only by understanding.
So much to trace out first.
Yeah, you
Lots
have to get
of little things, but that build to a big thing.
Well, you can't see the entire mountain or the entire, I suppose, circumference of its the base of its foundation, except from the top. The only way to see the entire, you'd have to get at the top of the mountain to see the entire foundation of it. If you were at one point of the foundation of the mountain, you wouldn't see the whole foundation. So it's only from the top that you can see an entire foundation. So the only way you can even begin to discuss axioms is from the top, frankly. And so but that means you have to spend 3 hours to get to the top of the mountain. and let me ask you this: if you were climbing a mountain with someone, would you want the person climbing with you to constantly be arguing with you? You would never get to the top. You would never get to the top. It's another way to look at this is if you're trying to build a cathedral with someone, which is basically if you're having a conversation on a great idea, you're trying to build something. Yeah. Do you want people co-workers who are always bickering or arguing or difficult? No, you want to work with someone who you are getting along with, you can speak to, who you can work with. Well, that's how philosophers are. They're looking for people that it's hey, we're going to try to build a cathedral, which we're going to try to see the entire shape of the mountain from the top, and I need someone I can walk to the top who's not going to disagree with me every 5 seconds, who's going to make their objective getting to the top of the mountain, not being the one who gets there first, or who gets there, in a way that is boosting their ego. So that changes the dynamic. Right. Whereas in the culture, the name of the game is to beat the people you are speaking with, to prove yourself right and to prove them wrong. But again, I go back to this point, is the philosopher understands that you can't even have a true disagreement except from the systems level.
Oh, yeah.
Because and that requires fully understanding the other person's system. Because if you don't fully understand the other person's system, you can't disagree with it. Because you don't understand it. So you have to spend 3 hours understanding it, if not 3 years.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think, too, there can be... I think look, somebody who vehemently opposes I mean, I think any of us...
See, we're disagreeing with Javier right here, saying we need another person. He listen to this, and he's like...
He's like, I never said any of this, guys.
They are debating. This is not a discussion. They are not entering into my system. They are not
He's like, I never said any of this. I don't know what they're talking about.
I disagree. I disagree.
We love you, Javier.
I'm sorry, man. Love you. But it's a great topic because people worry about this all the time. I have many people who worry about it.
But like, honestly, like, even...
I know many people
Yeah, even without Javier having said that, sure. I just the other day... It's funny, I think just the other day, we had drawn the same conclusion as Javier, actually, about this other topic. And I was kind of like... I felt like... It's weird, like the words got stuck in my mouth when I was like... That we came to the same conclusion. I was kind of like, is that bad? Is that wrong that we came to the same conclusion?
But it's
like,
cultural.
Is that confirmation bias?
Yes.
You know, and so it's like, I can struggle with this too. Like, where you you can also feel the sense of like, oh, that like, generally speaking, that was like, well, I mean, I always find philosophical conversations extremely fun in a sense, and because you are grappling with something, it's really neat. You never know what exactly, what exactly the person's going to bring to the table and where that's going to go. So I think it's really, really, there's something very exciting about philosophical conversation. But the fact that you're kind of like, there is this beautiful orchestration going on, okay?
Yes.
Like, I think there's something really cool happening there. And it's almost like, because I don't know. It's almost like because we think of work and productivity just in terms of like obligation and like blood, sweat, and tears and fighting and like, you know, and relationships are only real if like, you know, well, you had a fight. Well, but that's good because, you know, that's part of, you know, that's part of life. Like, that's part of relationships. You fight and then you make up and you get stronger. It's like it's weird. We only think of it. I know that I can struggle with this too. Basically this, that if there's something actually that ends up being like, just all around pleasant and great, that somehow you're like, maybe I didn't do it right.
Sure.
Which is so weird. Like, it's not something I know because we've talked about it extensively. I know now that when that thought comes into my head, I'm like, that's silly. I'm just gonna keep doing these things. You know.
Sure.
But you could kind of self-sabotage, as we talked about.
Oh yeah.
Where you're like, maybe because it was like all around great, I'm just doing something wrong. Maybe I suck. I'm not going to do this anymore.
Yeah.
You know? And it's like, no. That means you're like, no, keep going. Like, don't stop. Keep going with this. You know what I'm saying? And I think we also don't honor the fact that there is struggle amidst a conversation, and there are tensions held there, because we don't have place for the nuanced difference, as we talk about. All we have from our conditioning of the society is the loud clashing, you know, overt, explicit difference.
Well, you know, a few things. Well, you know, one... No, there's good... No, you know, a few things. One, if you listen to a person talk in a philosophical discussion, they're constantly bringing up on their own counterpoints, addressing them and going through. In political discussions, they'll make a point and then fall silent and wait for the other side to bring the counterpoint. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons you don't disagree with the person you're speaking so much with with the philosophy is you disagree with yourself. Yeah. You'll notice how they talk. Like, you're going through, and then after you go through your own dialectical process, you arrive at conclusion X, and then you're like, and then you pass it off to Javier. But you go through a lot of the stuff that Javier, for example, could have disagreed with you with on your own to get to X, and by the time you get to X, he's listened to you, and he's like, yes, you know, X makes sense. And then he incorporates X into another dialectical process of Y. Right. So there's a lot of passing a baton back and forth, but you on your own, you know, Javier, if you stopped in the middle of your point, but you'll notice also in philosophical discussion, points will go, one party will talk for 5 minutes nonstop. The other side will talk for 5 minutes nonstop. In political discussion, somebody says a sentence, falls quiet. The other person says... Right. The dialectical... So let's put it... In politics, the dialectical process is made much more horizontal.
And I'll say this happens a lot in family and relational dynamics, too.
I'm saying politics, but we basically could say society at large. You know, but I do...
the politicization of conversation, really.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Right? That, this is why, unfortunately, drama can happen in you know, relationships and... family.
Yeah, and you see, the thing is, in the political, if I'm just going to stick to that language, in the political structure, the other in the conversation is made the other side of the dialectic. So you say a premise, and you wait for them to reply. Then you say a premise, you wait for them to reply. In the philosopher, they just do it all vertically. They all do that dialectical process in themselves. Yes. And then they kind of advance, and they'll speak for 5 to 10 minutes nonstop. And then they'll get to X, and the other side is listening and go, oh, okay, that makes sense. And now they're talking about X. Yeah. So, because here's the thing. Politically, your goal, you want to be right. And so that's your goal, to be right. So if I can just say sentence, premise 1, and they never reply to it, I'm right. Why in the world would I shoot all my bullets, per se, at the beginning by talking for 5 minutes and making my entire case? I could win the debate at any point if they don't reply to a premise I make. So then I win. But the philosopher wants to get through as many premises as quickly as possible to ascend the mountain, because they're trying to determine the truth. So they don't want to waste any time going back and forth, because the philosopher person, like if they say, point A, and the person that, they're speaking to doesn't reply, the philosopher's like, hurry up, we need to move. So if the philosopher themselves can address the counterpoint to A, to B, they're going to do that to advance quickly. They're not trying to not trying to win.
Not that there's some rush, but it's almost just like, we understand that, it's almost like there's a kind of a feeling of well, thank you for giving me your time. Yes. I don't want to waste it.
So let's hurry. Let's go on to the high level.
So let's get, let's make good use of this time.
Yes.
And therefore, we're not going to waste any of that time by not, in your own point, addressing the things that should be addressed if you're going to be thorough, and to then pass off the baton, basically.
And that almost by definition means there's going to be a lot less, quote unquote, disagreement between the two parties than in a political discussion, which makes you think you're doing something wrong, because each philosopher in the discussion is internalizing so much of the disagreement to themselves and addressing it, which of course doesn't sound like disagreement. That's the issue.
That's the issue. That's why in my anchor talk I really fleshed out this analogy. Well, I hope I fleshed it out enough. But of the symphony, instruments.
Yeah. Yes.
Versus the noise.
Yes.
Like you said, it doesn't sound like disagreement.
Yes.
Right? So a lot of times our ears are kind of, it's like you hear this big clashing, big sound, like big rumbling, destructive sound, and you're like, what's going on? What's happening?
Yes.
But if you just heard, literally, let's just say, in the background, you just hear some sort of some very nice, but just some kind of quiet, classical song.
Yes.
Okay? You just be like, oh, okay,
Yes, it doesn't stand out.
It doesn't stand out. That doesn't mean, I think that's why. Okay, so it doesn't stand out. Okay,
right.
It's kind of almost like the functioning doorknob, right? Like in the Heideggerian sense, right? Yeah. The big boom.
Sure.
All of the boom sounds. Okay, I was like, oh, what's going on?
Yep.
And I think too, honestly, if I'm just really being honest about, I think what mainstream culture, there could be boredom. And so people are looking for something to be happening.
Yeah, they're looking for a fight.
Yeah. They're looking for something to be happening. And even for those who do not ascribe to that necessarily, and don't necessarily aren't finding themselves bored, they still kind of, unfortunately, because the majority might feel that way, they sometimes have to kind of pander to that, kind of play into that sometimes. And so sometimes you still get trained to think in that way.
Yes.
Because you're almost like, I guess that's what everyone else does. So in almost a survival mode, you almost have to do that too.
Sure.
And so I guess what I mean to say is so then you're like, oh, what's happening? And it's but we almost value just that. We don't realize that, oh, what's actually happening is bad.
Yes.
And if we take from a value standpoint, that's bad versus the beautiful, classical song or whatever. Let's just make classical jazz song or something that's playing, and you're like, wow, turn that up. Now I'm gonna make that the louder element and kind of emphasize that, and then listen to it and really, really be like, wow, let me listen to this and actually hear what's going on and what's happening within that more quiet type of...
Yeah, what are the dynamics? Does the notes go together?
Right.
Around midnight or something? I mean, exactly right. Well, it gets into as well where, I mean, yeah, there's something to be said. There is good reason to be...
Maybe the reactive feels more real and alive because we're like, there's just something about it that feels more, I don't know, more dynamic.
Well, I think there's a few things. One, I think the human brain is almost more attracted to quick back and forth than someone talking not continuously for 5 minutes, because if someone people's minds just turn off, and so they don't even hear the dialectical process that the philosopher person is doing. They just kind of fade out. Where if someone goes back and forth, quick premises,
it's like a volley.
It's like a volley. It's like, ooh, they can follow it. But really, what they're following, this is the problem. Usually in debates, what people is following is not so much the arguments, but the emotions. They're following the emotional charge of the arguments. And that's why they just continually slip into ad hominem and different things like that. The other things, too, like the philosopher, when you well, first off, Kierkegaard had that idea that the man in despair doesn't know he's in despair. I mean, if you're even asking, is this confirmation bias? Exactly. That's a pretty good sign that it's not confirmation bias. Like you tend to be in confirmation bias when you don't think about confirmation bias.
And you don't want to think about it.
Yeah, you do everything in your power not to think about it. I mean, the other thing you can do if you're afraid of confirmation bias, think back on your history. When you were younger and you thought Hegel was stupid, and then you read Hegel and you went, nah, I guess there's something here. Remember those times you changed your mind. Remember those times when you had discussion and you refined your view. Look back on your own life and have remembrance like, no, I actually I've changed my views on things. I've actually read the books I disagree with. Like, if you have a history of changing your mind or developing your thinking, that right there should give you reason to not be so worried about it. Yeah. The other thing, before I forget, I wanted to note is that if we follow something like Randall Collins' sociological theory of intellectual development and different things, I don't see this. I don't see these groups like the Bloomsburg Group or the Scottish Enlightenment. These people are different and exceptional. They're not disagreeing all the time. Like, they're not making a point to disagree. Oh yes, Virginia Woolf and Keynes disagree, but they're primarily discussing and having these discussions. So this idea that like new ideas are created by like vehement, angry debate, I don't see it. I don't see the real big ideas coming out of massive debate. I see it coming out of the like disagreement and difference and like but I see it coming out of disagreement on the systems and axiomatic layer, which requires years possibly of conversations and discussions. Like, another way to put this is like, people think it's like in politics you start with disagreement and you get to agreement. Well, philosophy people understands that you have to actually kind of start with a lot of agreement on the meaning of terms, on like the goals, the telos, and different things, and then you get to the disagreement. Yeah. But we're so trained by the culture that we think you're supposed to start with disagreement. Like, if you don't start with disagreement, there's like a problem. Philosophers, if I use that as as the term, they're really concerned about like defining terms, making sure the other side understands exactly what they're saying. So like, they'll talk for 5 minutes nonstop and say, and by justice I mean, by freedom I mean. You listen to political people, like if we keep using the abortion debate, a person will say life begins at conception, and the other side will say no, it doesn't. Whereas we say, well, life begins at, a philosopher will be like, okay, well, I think life begins at conception, and by life I mean, that you have the full human DNA, and the reason I think the full human DNA means that there's life is because that would be the non-conditionality that makes life life. You can't put it as consciousness, because when you're asleep and you're not dreaming, consciousness is not there, and it would still be wrong to murder you, so on and so forth, and you can reply to that. But the philosopher person's going to go, by life I mean, they're going to keep going, where the political person will just say life begins at conception and wait for the other side to reply, because the philosopher spends a lot of time making sure the other side understands exactly what they're saying. So then there's a lot of disagreement cut out right there, because so much disagreement occurs in everyday conversations because people don't accept the terms. They don't understand what the other side is saying. And the philosophers also, because they're concerned about truth, they also want to bring along their person they are speaking with on their journey. There's a mutual wanting to bring each other along. Politically, they don't want to bring the other person along. They want to leave them in the dust.
Yeah, and it's so funny. Like, I think, honestly, for me, I'm like, if I want to see a good fight, like, I'll watch UFC or something.
Yes.
Like, I think, and there can be place for that. I think there can be something very exhilarating, like about like a really good boxing match or something like that. But like, for me, when it comes to the philosophical discussion, I guess for me, I don't understand what the purpose is, except to like, basically just have one person be made to feel bad and the other person be made to feel like an inflated victor, Sure. And it's like, I'm not sure what it does for truth exactly.
In the political sphere, not very little. Obviously, because people, we see from the numbers that people are just becoming more and more partisan. Yeah. The middle is eroding. Disagreement does not seem like it. There's this idea that disagreement is going to lead to more truth. We see in the political world, disagreement just leads to more tribalism. When people disagree, they just become more fundamentalist in their views. They don't moderate. What tends to lead to moderation can be things like where people live around one another who are different from them, when they interact regularly with them. It's not really disagreeing, it's like living with them. In a sense, what the philosopher is trying to do in discussion is live with the other person, figure out how to live the good life. they're trying to kind of like, let's examine experience itself. Let's examine how our life has, been in different ways. And that's where you see in the political sphere moderation occurs, is when people live together. Well, in a sense, through dialogue and discussion, philosophers are talking about, well, there's, their lived experience, and actually, but not merely expressing, their lived experience, but analyzing and structuring their lived experience. So you don't have as much disagreement because the philosopher person's like disagreement, except if not on the systems level, is just going to keep us from getting to the top of the mountain. So we're not going to point to disagree. Like, again, when philosophers disagree, they ask a question. They'll say, well, what do you mean by life? If we go back to the abortion. Like, if philosophers are talking about abortion and someone says, well, I think life begins at conception, they say, oh, well, what do you mean by life? What do you mean by conception? They would ask a question.
Oh, yeah.
That's how they express disagreement. It doesn't sound like disagreement. Or, well, another way to put this, let's put it this way. The philosopher is often in the business of suspended judgment.
Oh, yeah.
They're like, well, if I'm going to say I disagree, I want to make sure I know exactly what you're saying. So let me ask you first, before I tell you that I disagree. What do you mean by life? So the philosopher is constantly suspending judgment. Yes. By definition, disagreement requires a judgment. You have to judge that this person is wrong. So if the philosopher is in the business, because they've kind of learned that suspended judgment is almost necessary to elevate the conversation and to keep it going. So in politics, you judge as soon as possible because you want to determine your friend from your foe now. Do you agree with me or not, friend or foe? The philosopher is like, well, we're both in this together. And also the philosopher asks, I'm only going to directly voice antagonism and disagreement if I think it's going to add value. Like if it's going to help us get to the top of the mountain. And the philosopher from experience sees that that's very, very, very rare. It doesn't seem to be productive. It doesn't seem to do much. Or at least it's not the most profitable way. And so they gradually will do it less than more, if at all. Because it's funny because like you said, like if you don't make a loud noise when you disagree, people don't think it's disagreement at all. But it can be disagreement. If you were to say, well, I think life begins at conception, I'd say, oh, well, that's interesting. I guess my idea of life would be a conscious state because that's where personhood begins. I just voiced a disagreement. I just made it sound friendly. I just made it sound nice. I just told you that life doesn't begin at conception. It begins with consciousness because it didn't sound like disagreement, but it straight up was disagreement. And that's the other thing, is we're actually trained to hear noise, not to hear logic.
Well, that's the thing, too. Like, what's interesting about that is, like, because we're trained to hear noise, we don't even actually hear the actual disagreement. Does that make any sense?
No, we don't. Yeah.
And so it's very... I feel like we are very removed, actually, from the very substance of that which we are trying to get at, really.
Oh, yeah.
And, like in the case of somebody saying, life begins at conception, and another person saying life begins at a consciousness, those two people can say those things, like you said, amicably. And because they said them amicably,
yes,
it will not be considered to be a disagreement,
even
though they just
like
stated
one.
Something that was basically in opposition to one another. And so I think that's very, very interesting because there seems to be this, like, for some reason, a craving for the noise.
Yes.
More than even the substance.
Well, and I think this gets, you were talking about self-destruction, different things. I think this gets into the lizard brain, as they call it. Biologically, we want to know if we're safe. And, disagreement that's civil, it's hard to read. Is this safe? Is this dangerous? Is this going to destroy my worldview? If it's loud, then I'm like, okay, I know this is bad. So I'm going to, bracket it out. Or I know it's loud in my favor, so this is good. So I think there's an existential anxiety that can develop when there's, civil disagreement is unnerving, actually.
Well, yeah, because, if you, in the...
Yeah, you want to survive.
That makes it, you're almost like, I just don't know what to do with this, and to protect myself from that evolutionary standpoint, you're you just kind of, like you said, bracketed it out.
Well,
and also, go ahead.
Well, maybe it's different. The brain prefers a soldier in uniform to, a ninja. A civil 100%. Disagreement.
It's like a sniper versus, okay, they can see the person.
Yes.
and at least they can the noise lets them see, right? They're like, I can see who my opposition is,
yes.
and I know how to protect myself.
Yeah.
If you don't, then you're like, and see, people just there's such an oppositional thing that, you know, people just end up fighting themselves instead of like, oh, I don't know, fighting like evil and like
sure.
and working towards a good. Like, we're thinking about the mountain idea, right?
Sure.
Truth is always in conjunction with beauty and goodness.
Yes.
Right. So yes, we're fighting. We're fighting against, like, you know,
the mountain
I don't know,
nature. You know,
like like what tries to drag men into
yes.
destruction and death, and, you know, depression, anxiety. Like, that's what you're fighting.
Oh yeah, well,
so it's like there is a fight going on, and it is a noble fight. I think we sometimes like only see some sort of like noble fight in two people, you know, being up in arms with each other.
Well, if we take the Christian idea, you're fighting principalities more than people.
Yes, exactly.
And that's usually what the philosopher is interested. The philosopher is trying to fight like systems of illogic, zeitgeists, principalities. They're not really interested in individuals and like people. You know, another key like,
and maybe they'd put up a good fight to like defend their loved ones.
Of course, but that's
like,
a different. But that's moving from the intellectual to the physical sphere.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing, like a civil debate, like the lizard brain, like if you're having a civil debate with someone, you have to trust that they're not like going to suddenly attack you.
Exactly, and that trust element is really really huge, you know.
Yeah, and so if you have a trustless, you know, a society that doesn't trust anymore.
Right, Dr. Glass talks a lot about that. Like,
oh,
how
yeah.
trust has been eroded so much.
Well, then you're not going to have civil debate.
Right.
You know, there's just everyone's, they're trying to get some, you know, you don't trust that anyone is genuinely interested in the truth. You don't trust that anyone is trying to climb a mountain. You just assume that everyone's out to get everyone else. And so it's an antagonistic relationship.
Exactly.
I mean, it also is bad if people don't believe ideas can make your life better. Then the only reason anyone would do this is because they've got an agenda beyond the truth. I mean, if people don't believe truth exists, or let's put it, they don't believe it matters, or philosophy doesn't have any practical impact of your life, that right there is going to make people suspicious of any civil discussion to truly be a civil discussion and not have a secret agenda. So the lizard brain goes crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think though, like, just to kind of you know, when Javier was talking about like having somebody who vehemently opposes, I think to the defense of that thought, I do think there can be some. Of course, like, it can be great when you get challenged more. Maybe just because you're like, I want to be able to. I want to like try to jump over a higher hurdle.
Sure.
So you're like, okay, yeah, bring in like that you know, that giant bass drum, and we'll see if we can make a song with the bass drum.
Yeah,
that
sure.
giant bass drum too. You know, we got the djembe, the big giant bass drum of the vehemently opposing person, and we get like, you know, Javier and the hobo and me on the violin.
Sure.
So it's like, I get that, and I think that is really great. But see, there's always space for that. I think there's always space left for that in these types of conversations, because you're saying like, oh, you literally admit, I don't know.
Yes.
Is there something that is that is happening that would satisfy XYZ? So I think it's like there's always a space for that. Now maybe there's not somebody there who can propose something that looks really really different than maybe the proposals given in that conversation. But even just the space created for that, you can at least maybe entertain at least some possibilities yourself.
Well, and that brings, you know, the other thing that's critical is another reason why you won't hear philosophers, quote unquote, disagree as much, is because they spend a whole lot of time tracing out, and you'll hear them say constantly, maybe, I don't know, I can't say that everyone, you know, like, should live X, Y, or Z way. Right. Like, the philosopher is so often, like, tracing concepts, exploring concepts. Yeah. And then when it comes to actually declaring how people should live, they would say, well, you know, based on what we traced out, there's like, you could do A, B, or C, and it's optimal. All three of those options would be valid based on what we traced out. Now, we did trace out that E would not be good, but we've traced out that A, B, and C are all equally good reason to think they're good, and I'm not going to tell people if they should do B, C, or A, so you decide. Well, in order to, like, have a vehement disagreement, you'd have to say everyone should do A. So, you know, so that's another reason why it doesn't have the same tone, you know, that you'll hear, because you're tracing things out.
Basically, I'm just saying I don't think Javier's asking for people screaming at each other.
No. I mean, well, look, there's something to be said. Well, the thing is,
I think it's just like when you're like, oh, I'd love to be challenged even further or have a higher hurdle or.
Well, the issue is, here's the thing, like, in order to, like, have a productive challenging, you know, we said earlier that to truly disagree with someone, they have to, like, really understand one another. like really, like in order to disagree on the high level. Well, the issue is, therefore, in order to bring someone who can add a valuable disagreement, you would have to almost have a filtering, or a process of determining if they've gotten up to that place, which in itself would require a conversation that sounds like there's too much agreement. So you would be skeptical of it and wouldn't think it's a true disagreement. And then if they disagree only on the high level place, it's going to feel like, okay, well, they agree with 80% of what I said, so does that count as a real disagreement? Because that's the other thing, is usually high-level disagreements have like 85% overlap. Because that's the other problem a lot of times, where it's like, well, I just want to make sure we have someone who disagrees. Well, what percentage of disagreement constitutes real disagreement? Well, that's a relativity issue. One person may say 60, another may say 20, another may say 80. But since it becomes ultimately a subjective judgment of what constitutes enough disagreement to make a person an opponent, it's ultimately going to feel fluffy. So you're almost naturally going to gravitate toward the loud, angry person, maybe to a lesser degree, because that one feels more solidly like an opponent. But then, of course, very problematically, since a philosophical discussion must get to the higher levels in order to discuss, that very way of disagreeing is going to cause the conversation probably to fail and not do much.
It's kind of, it stalls. It kind of feels like it can stall out there.
Yeah, because well, one, let's say you get a disagreement with someone and they disagree with your definition of love. Well, what do you do there? Like, they don't even agree with your term of love. Like, you can't have so much disagreement that they don't accept your terms. And then you have to have an argument about what the right definition of the terms is, and then the right definition of the terms used in that, and so on and so forth. Right, and that's why it requires all this self-work.
And I think, too, like we've talked about, I think what I appreciate, at least, about the philosophical discussions versus the, if you will, mainstream debates, is that I feel like you are invited into the process. Like we said, you take the person along, or the viewers. I mean, the viewers you get excluded very quickly from politicized conversation, and either you feel forced to take a side, or you're just like, I don't know, if it's like say someone's parents and you're watching this happen, you're kind of like, well, I don't want to take a side, I'm gonna go to my room. Well, so basically it's like it kind of, I think it's very, it excludes, unfortunately, or it tribalizes and just gains this kind of momentum of a tribe. And so there's that. But what I appreciate about philosophical discussion is that what excites me is that I know that they're going to challenge themselves.
Yes. And
I feel very much invited along the process. Because let's say they have a disagreement about what the word love is. Well, I think that somebody who's doing if you're being a good philosopher in the Humean sense, right? The Hume good philosopher versus bad philosopher. Right. If you're being a good philosopher, then if you have a disagreement about love, the word love, okay, if you've got some term disagreement, you're going to go then stop there on like the bigger, whatever your bigger topic of discussion is, and you're going to take 20 to 30 minutes, possibly even, just to talk about love. Yes. Like, what do you mean by love? What do you mean? Do the Socratic. Do the Socratic.
It's like hyperlinks, like
exactly.
Click.
And so it's like, for me, I feel like I enjoy that immensely, because there is so much to unpack. Yes. And even their disagreement feels very productive. Well, like this nuanced difference. It feels productive because they're willing to work out, this is how I define love, and this is why, and here's all these examples. And then the other person says, this is how I define love, and here's my terms, and here's all my examples.
But to do all that, the person you're speaking with cannot be too disagreeable, like emotionally, or too disagreeable, all of which will make you suspicious because you've been trained by the culture that there's no truth if there's not disagreement, basically. And so you're always going to be suspicious of the process.
And that's the thing. Like, again, I don't want to put words in Javier's mouth about disagreement or vehement opposition, et cetera. But just from a personal perspective, I think that what you just said is so true and so conditioned in us from the society at large of it's not truth unless there's disagreement. Yes. It's not real unless there's fighting, like in relationships. It's not, and all this stuff. And it's kind of like, this trickles down. This taints everything. This taints everything. So it can even taint the philosopher's mind of like, am I doing good enough if I'm not having, a fight or disagreements, the loud ones, the ones that you can very obviously notice and see.
But again, it becomes like there are like David Hume and Adam Smith, for example, on economics and money. There's like 90% overlap, but then there's 10% difference on like what the word sentiment versus empathy means. Like Plato and Aristotle are using the same terms all the time. And sometimes Plato talks about things that Aristotle doesn't talk about. There are dialogues in Plato that are not in Aristotle. Yeah. Maybe there's no dialogue, there's no notes, or, in Aristotle we only have notes, we're covered by, notes. Well, maybe it's because Aristotle agreed with all of that in Plato, and so he saw no need to write about it. There is so much that Aristotle and Plato agree on, but when it comes to the precise functions of things like form, essence, and substance, they have disagreements because of their emphasis, or their notion of the soul, and etc., or the mind, or whatever you want to translate that as. So almost when you talk about philosophy, or deep thought in general, because if you're going to do any deep thought about anything, you basically are doing philosophy, even if it's about literature or science, because you have to get into the methods of science, so on and so forth. Deep thought is more so something of, like you said, is more about process and refinement, where oftentimes political and social discussion is about disagreement and who wins.
Absolutely. I think that's a great way to distill that, for sure. And I think it's like this fine-tuning constantly in philosophical discussion.
Yeah, you're not trying to win. It's like you're trying to, you take a wrench and you're trying to tighten it just enough so you don't, mess up the screw and too low so it's tight.
Well, it's like, it makes me think back to my analogy in the Anchor talk of the instruments.
Yeah.
There's a lot of fine-tuning when it comes to symphony orchestras and things like that. Lots of fine-tuning on violins, etc. Versus the debate where you just got, smashing guitars and stuff, and it's just like...
Yes.
Who's the last man standing? Never mind the fact that all your instruments are broke. Everything's broken, and you can't play a single song, but, these guys are all on the floor and I'm standing. And again, don't get me wrong, it could be really fun to watch, boxing, fighting, but that's, I feel like that's where it really shines in that arena. But when it comes to, the pursuit of truth and ideas, to me, I don't see... I don't know. For me personally, it doesn't feel as productive when I witness people just really bashing heads on terms, but not willing to even discuss why they bash their head on those terms.
Yes.
And it's just kind of well, what are we doing here exactly? This is taking up about, a significant portion of the conversation, just because you decide you define a word differently, but you won't go into why you define that term differently, and so it feels unproductive. But again, unfortunately, we've kind of just, like you said, we have this kind of in the background, this sort of sense of it better be hard, and there better be some shouting for it to be a real thing.
And that's why there's no progress. I mean, because
the fine tuning doesn't happen, which is so essential to an actually harmonious, beautiful orchestration. Right?
Yeah, if there's no fine tuning, there's no progress. I mean, at the end of the day, all progress comes down to fine-tuning.
I just love this image of my head of, I've got this beautiful, symphony pit orchestra over here on the left. On the right. You don't even have to tune your instruments if you're going to just, smash them.
And
literally use them as
There's
weapons.
No incentive to. People don't.
They don't. So they just, have these out-of-tune things that they're just, whipping around like weapons,
well,
basically.
in fact, if you have a culture that is given into the lizard brain that is suspicious of all civil discussion because they think it's ninjas or something, like we were saying earlier, there's incentive not to tune your instrument, because you could make an enemy, you could be framed as a danger, to your friends or your community. So there's actually incentive to be part of the noise and to not participate in the fine tuning and so on and so forth. And for those listening, that's Reed sleeping and snoring.
Yeah.
That's our baby snoring.
Our littlest is snoring away.
Yeah, he's snoring. So that's what a baby sounds like when they snore. So you can refine your concept of baby snore now to this sound, because you've heard it. You know how to refine your concept. But no, the other thing that's so, you keep using the word productive. People think it's not productive unless there's disagreement. The whole name of the game is progress, right? In a concept, refining it productive. That's the goal. It doesn't matter if you disagree or you agree or you feel good or you feel bad. All that matters is that there's a kind of climbing the mountain. There can be disagreement and even in debate, in discussion, but there's usually not discussion in debate. You can get debate in discussion, but you usually don't get discussion in debate. And the form of debate in discussions tends to just have a different tone in a different way. It tends to be questions. It tends to be refinement, or go, okay, well, that's what you mean by love, but this is what I mean. Why do you think that way? I usually no one ever says you're wrong.
Yeah, or just,
because in the same way that the good fiction writer doesn't tell you, they show you. Yes. The good philosopher doesn't tell you they're wrong. They explain why you're wrong. So they show you you're wrong. But we're so conditioned to think that there's only disagreement when there's explicit disagreement. That's another term, like direct telling, that we don't think any disagreement occurred when there could be very intense disagreements. But the other thing is philosophers will, if they are convinced that they are wrong, they change their mind. They just say, okay, you're right, and they keep going. Let's keep going up the mountain. You're right. We should go right instead of left. We're going to go that way. So they will so readily go, they'll so readily go with the new course, that it will seem like no disagreement occurred because we're so used to fighting down to the last man. But the philosopher's like, no, you're right. That's the correct way. Let's keep going. Let's keep going. So just the way, I just think it's very important that the way that opposition manifests in philosophical discussion of progress is in fact disagreement. But it tends to be done in a way that makes it seem like it is not there. And it does in fact tend to be done after a long process of trying to understand one another, none of which seems like disagreement, so that you can get to the high order questions.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I'll just say this one more thing really quick.
Sure.
I think it's fun. It's very interesting because I remember hearing somebody say that he can always debate a point, and I was kind of like, it was interesting to me because I'm just like, it's funny because we don't. I feel like we actually. I wonder sometimes if we even have a proper place for nuanced discussion.
No.
It's almost like it's not even. It's almost not even a category that people think about very often.
No.
And they simply hear nuanced discussion as somebody trying to fight.
Oh yeah.
Or win. I think that philosophical discussion, people just hear that and it's weird. I think because they hear it and they're like, I don't even know what to do with this.
So they put in a debate structure.
So they either throw it out as this is baloney,
sure.
or they say this is debate, and those people are just trying to win.
Oh, it's terrifying.
And it's like no, they're not. People I think people just are they hear it and they're and also though people can have a distaste for debate because of the politicization.
Yes.
So all they hear is people being manipulative.
Oh yes.
You're having a philosophical discussion. You're being manipulative.
Oh, it's
and
bad.
It's no.
It's very bad.
No, are you listening to what they're saying? Did you hear anything that the person just said? It's I just think this is where we hear the noise, not the substance, and I think that's very interesting. I feel like there's something probably pretty deep there, but I don't.
It's the end of democracy, is what it is.
Well, yes.
It is the end of civil discourse.
I guess I'm just what is it that we want the shell but not the substance? What is that?
We want understanding. We want deep discussion. We want civil.
Maybe we just want it to be easy too. We want it to be easy. It's easier to grasp a facade, right? You can't hold up a person by their face, but you can hold a mask.
Oh yes. Oh well, that's a nice image. Yeah, no, it's the end of democracy basically, because our education system has trained us to think in terms of trivia. We've discussed that before.
Yes.
Question to think of right and wrong, which don't get me wrong, there is right and wrong, but right and wrong can only be determined at the top of the mountain, but we've not been given the ability to get to the top of the mountain, so we disagree on premises, which are usually not even disagreements, but misunderstandings that are wrongly labeled. And we just in the business of finding people who agree with us. And you see, so what ends up happening, what Javier is saying, is okay, we exist in a culture of tribalism, where everyone is just wanting to hear what they want to hear.
Yeah.
How can we be so sure that we're not doing the same? So,
exactly.
Javier, the sentiment is very legitimate, because we do in fact exist in a world with algorithms that are giving you the stories that you want to read and just feeding what you want to believe. But the difference comes from paying attention to the structure of the discussion, remembering your own history of thinking through things, looking at your own motives, knowing your own motives. What are your motives? Yeah. Are you here to win, or are you here to determine truth? You know yourself in that way.
And that's why I think it's kind of it's funny, this inside joke with this friend from middle school, me and my twin sister.
Sure.
I just suddenly came back in my head of like, I win at life. It was this like funny thing we would say. But the point is that I think that is the thing, though. You're interested in winning in life, like not in the sense of like this, but winning in life, living a good life.
The good life.
Yes, and that's what me and Javier got into. It's like I don't think we ask questions about the good life anymore. Like, what does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean to live a noble life? Things like that. So it's like, but people, I think we just think about it as like who will win. Well, we don't. It's not about winning winning at life anymore. I think it's just about winning this very, short-lived kind of victory. And it's like, well, what about the overall? What about like the life itself being the victory? If that makes sense.
Because we don't believe anymore that philosophy and all these things can help you with that.
Yeah.
We don't believe that. And of course, if you believe that it doesn't, you therefore don't do it, and therefore give yourself evidence that it doesn't work. Like if you don't do it, then it doesn't work. which then is evidence that you shouldn't do it. That's the horror. Is once you lose civil discourse and once you lose the fruits of philosophy and theology and thinking and these things, well, then it conceals itself. Mm-hmm. The loss is total. It's a total depravity, to use that Calvinistic term again. It's like if you lose civil discourse, then you also lose the evidence that civil discourse was possible.
I think people are hungry for it, though.
They are, but it doesn't. It's almost
maybe they don't know what that is that they're hungry for.
Well, it almost makes it worse, because when you have a sense that you're missing something, that you don't have the language to articulate what it is, you just become crazed. And that's almost like in like some ideas of like hell, and it's like people like part of the torture of hell is knowing that having a sense that they missed out on God, but they can't place the thought. So it's almost like a worm bearing into their mind or different things. So, the fact that, I think you're right. I think there is something about human beings that want depth in philosophy and civil discourse. But in not having philosophy and civil discourse, they don't even have the ability to articulate what it is they want. And so it's this vague feeling, this kind of sense in the air that something is wrong, that they cannot get a grasp on. And so it makes the torture all the worse. Because in order to articulate the problem, you need the skills that make the problem not a problem. And so there's a total depravity there that's very problematic. The fall of nations tend to conceal why they fell. We have this kind of notion, unfortunately. We think that if like the world were to fall apart, we'd also or at the end of history or whatever, we'd also in that moment understand why the world fell apart. Like the apocalypse will always bring a revelation, per se, and and that gets linked together because apocalypse gets tied to unveiling. No. When things fall apart, they usually conceal the reasons why they fall apart. You don't even get the satisfaction of an understanding of why they fall apart.
And that happens a lot with breakups and
absolutely.
That happens a lot. You'll hear people say that I just can't make sense of it. I don't understand.
Well, if you follow Dante, there's an idea that if the love is what moves the sun and other stars, then the nature of relationships is going to give you insight into the nature of reality itself.
Exactly.
And so So the fact that relationships have that sort of self-concealing of why they occurred could indeed trace on to the nature of nations themselves and societies.
Absolutely, Daniel.
But I also just wanted to add, with on this idea with Javier and philosophers and bringing in someone as the other view, sometimes if you're afraid that you're being self-deceived, or you're not actually seeing the different thought, you can bring someone in to make sure you're getting closer to the truth, which then, because you're afraid that you weren't getting close to the truth, you then create the conditions that make you not get closer to the truth, and then you despair. Because if you bring on the wrong people who disagree because you're afraid of being wrong, well then...
Not that Javier is.
Not that Javier is, but this can happen. It becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because of what you fear is what comes unto you.
Oh yeah, and I bring this up in the Anchor Talk. What you fear is what comes unto you. So if you're afraid you're not being objective, well, then you end up creating a condition where you aren't objective
and can't be objective because the philosophical process is not possible anymore because it's truncated along the way.
Right, and that might seem like a very gigantic, what do you mean by that exactly? But I think that if we think about it, in a simple fashion, if you are afraid that you're not seeking truth, you end up despairing.
Yes.
You end up stopping your pursuit.
Yes.
And then now you aren't pursuing truth.
That's correct.
So and people are like, well, it doesn't happen that simply. Yes, it does.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It happens every day of the week like that. And so it's just you. You can't stop yourself. You have to continue. You have to keep going. I think the fact that sometimes you can have the feelings of like, well, am I, if you think to yourself like, am I doing this right? Am I allowing myself to be challenged? Well, know that you are. And then keep going. And if you don't think you are, go read a book that disagrees with you. Go listen to somebody you disagree with.
Yes.
Continue. Don't stop. Keep on fighting and keep on moving along. And welcome discussion. And just know that these fine-tuning types of conversations though are very formative and very much a part of that journey. And the headway that you make in these nuanced philosophical discussions is really the real work.
Exactly.
It ties into the real work that you do in your own solitude.
Exactly. It's just critical to make your standard of determining if you're being objective, not the presence of disagreement with other people, but your own analysis of how hard you are working and how genuine you are in your pursuit of truth.
Absolutely.
Don't make your standard of judging your objectivity disagreement. Make it, how much do you try to disprove yourself?
Exactly.
How much do you try to read the books that show that you're wrong? How much do you try to seek truth? And how much do you work at it?
Yeah. And do you continue?
And continue. And don't strive and seek and refuse to yield, as Tennyson says. To what degree do you do these things? Make your standard of how much you seek the truth, the genuineness of your work, and pursue and plow ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for talking about this subject with me, Daniel. If you'd like to check out the Anchor recording, you can find it on our Anchor or Spotify, OG Rose.
And for more, you can go to ogrose.com and YouTube. And thank you for your time.
Thank you.